love to play guitar. I don't know. One of our faculty, Terry Kelly, plays guitar in jazz groups and things downtown. So that's kind of interesting. And years ago, we had another faculty member named Tom Buller, who was British, but he was a drum player, and he would play in groups downtown too. But when I switched into philosophy, I think I played clarinet one more semester, and then I was too busy and I dropped, because I was still in the band at my college, the marching band. I enjoyed all of those things and got good grades in those, but where I was failing was in music theory, sight singing. Both of those I had D's or F's. That meant I was going to Vietnam soon. The problem I had was in the pitch. I couldn't, in sight singing, you had to know so you had to hear the correct pitch and then sing it. And I would always be trying to figure out, okay, where are we? You know, everyone else is singing and I could join them. But I couldn't start off at a B flat. You know, that was, in fact, that was the note that keyed in the professor, so he knew I didn't have perfect pitch, and he, F for you, that was it. So that was sad. But turned out to be wonderful, because I probably would have been a horrible high school music teacher.
Spend all your time in band talking about Hegel.
Well, I wouldn't have even known about Hegel probably had I stayed in the music program, because there was no requirement to study philosophy except maybe the last semester, I don't know. So there's Facebook. I know, oh, that's my wedding.
You look awfully young.
I was younger then for some reason. I don't know. The one that's dressed like a bride is my wife. That was 46 years ago.
Does she still look like that?
Yes. Except she's not wearing the clothes that she had there. Now, that is a philosophy professor. Believe it or not. That is a philosophy professor. Her name is Susan, and she is a Heidegger specialist. But that was in the 90s. And when she was 22. And she isn't anymore. Same problem I'm not 22 anymore either. Now see, I went to this because I had posted something that I wanted to play, and notice all these folks who are even more addicted to me have loaded up. So I'm not going to. I will have to go this way, see if I can find it. There. So the one video that I had a link to on the syllabus for today disappeared because of, I guess, some copyright issues.
University of Wisconsin professor Jericho Ratner-Rosenhagen. He has said this who wrote many books of philosophy in all sorts of different forms. And all of them, from aphoristic, from essayistic, from longer form critiques, and all of them had something to do with the challenge of universal truth. So he took as his enemy the notion of universal truth, and pretty much all of his work has something to do with.
So she's a professor that's written a book on Nietzsche, although she explains in the video it's not just about Nietzsche, it's about Nietzsche's impact on the United States. She's a cultural historian of the United States, and so her book is all about the impact. There's also this is a segment from the video that I originally had posted. In fact, I think this is the beginning of it, but the whole thing isn't there. So have any of you watched these or familiar with them? I think she is very sexy, by the way. That's just... I don't know if that's a hashtag, Me Too or U3 or whatever.
Yes, we know because we have his school report here. You see it? That is brilliant. I never seen Nietzsche's school report. It is. I know it's Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. Absolutely.
So there are various interesting videos that you could watch. The piece in the text that we had assigned was a segment or a abridged section of his book, Beyond Good and Evil, which sounds kind of odd. What the heck is beyond good and evil? But let me try to put Nietzsche into some context. I've mentioned Hegel already, but let me remind you that Hegel basically gives us the organic model to replace the mechanical model of the universe. It's essentially the evolutionary view of the universe as opposed to the steady state universe that we associate with Sir Isaac Newton. Instead, it's really more like Einstein's theory of relativity, the idea that the universe is in a state of becoming, that it's an expanding universe is one of the model, associated model images we have of that, right? Everything's spreading out, including your own atoms, by the way. So it's not just the stars are moving farther away. That's one of the eerie aspects of this. Every particle in the universe is moving farther away from every other particle. So that's kind of an odd sort of thing. And the reason for that is that the actual fabric of the cosmos is expanding. So Stephen Hawking gives you the model of the balloon. If you took a balloon and you have a bunch of dots painted on the balloon and you're blowing the balloon up, you'll notice that all the dots start moving away from one another at equal rate. Well, actually, the farther away they are, the faster they expand from the others, which essentially what we see when we look at the stars and things of that sort. But if you think, well, it's the very fabric of the cosmos that's expanding, that includes your particles. So theoretically, eventually, the universe will get to a point, an entropic point, remember entropy, where everything will basically break down because the forces that hold everything together will no longer be able to work because everything will be too far away. And that's the cool that Dorian Sagan refers to when he says into the cool, right? That everything will collapse and so on. So it's an expanding universe. It's an evolutionary universe. So things change and adapt, etc. Right? And in that model, Hegel talks not only about, actually Hegel does not refer to animals or biology. He didn't realize that his model was going to change that model too. Remember his first publication of that, describing that was in 1807. And when we think of the biological evolution, it certainly is more involved than just saying Darwin gave it to us, but Darwin's main publication that really got things going was 1859. So you could see the impact of this change in Weltanschauung, which is the German for the worldview, right, is going to affect biology. It affects geology. You have the British beginning to recognize that the terrain is obviously changing. They didn't live, obviously, in Alaska, where you even noticed last night that the terrain is changing, right? You know, we have plate tectonics and so forth. We have even mathematics. You wouldn't think mathematics changes, but according to, can't think of his name offhand, Kitcher, Philip Kitcher, in his book, The Nature of Mathematical Knowledge, that even mathematics is evolving in an interesting sort of way. Of course, psychology, we get Freud and others that give us the sense that an individual evolves, that you're what we call maturing, of course. It's kind of an odd thing to look back into the Middle Ages and even into the modern period and realize that people, for some reason, thought children were like little adults. You know, you dress them up with smaller clothes, but they were basically adults. And if you think that way and you look at some of the paintings, like Velázquez, for example, painting the royal family in Spain, you get the kids that are small, but they look at you as if they're adults, which is a weird thing, since we know, well, that's not true. Kids definitely mature, and so on. Although it's also weird when you look at some of the ugliest paintings in the world, and that's the Madonna and Child, where Mary is sitting there with Jesus in her lap. I'll show you one. You'll see why I call them the ugliest paintings in the world. Just pick one. Some are worse than others, of course. Let's see. This is pretty ugly. See, he looks like a little tiny man, you know, with his faces. And by the way, notice her joints, her fingers are totally incorrect. The proportions are wrong. The drapery of her clothing is formalized. It's not the way clothes really would hang, etc. And that's kind of the way they all are. Here's another one. So you know, I mean, remember I was raised Roman Catholic, but I'm just being honest. Those are really ugly paintings. But no one was thinking about that. You know, by the way, they got much more beautiful when you get to the Renaissance. So, for example, let's go back. working on here. So notice the children are much more childlike, and the proportions on the woman are much closer to real life. The scenery in the background is totally screwed up, so they didn't have perspective yet. So just a little thing like art, for example, shows that culture evolves, that artists evolve their understanding of their own craft. Notice we don't even have names of artists up to a certain point, certainly because it was a craft, not a art, so as we think of it, so that we didn't have specific artists like Michelangelo or Botticelli that were absolutely outstanding in their field and knew things, maybe learning it from Da Vinci or others, that basically made them very, very special. Prior to that, the craftsmen that would do the work would not even sign their names. They weren't special. They were just doing a job, repeating, the picture the way it was supposed to be. We see culture evolves, and that's really the focus for Hegel when he talks about the becoming of the individual and the becoming of the individual in the state. I mean, we already have by Hegel, of course, the social contract concept of government, of legitimate government, comes from a relationship that we all together form our government for our own benefit. And what is that? We can trace that back to Adam Smith, David Hume, obviously John Locke. Rousseau is not really one of the best, Rousseau, of course, just led to the massive terror in France because of his views. Hobbes, of course, we could think of. So Hegel's piggybacking on the shoulders of giants, in the same way that Sir Isaac Newton talks about it, right? But the focus for Hegel is not only as an individual evolves and becomes a modern person and becomes self-reflective, which, of course, notice was incorporated in my definition of a person. By the way, just thank you for your input. This is very difficult. I'll get back further and see if that helps. But if you think about how you were defining a fetus, some of you absolutely think it's a person, others not. Others accept the idea that maybe there's kind of a dilemma there, as the various stages of fetushood, or whatever you want to call it, develop, etc. But all of that just goes to show that this is an ongoing social dilemma that we do not know as a society where we want to settle on this issue. We've got some folks that are absolutely adamant that abortion is wrong, and others that feel like it's totally up to the woman, especially depending on the situation. I didn't mention that Peter Singer argues that, if you're going to argue that it's okay to kill a fetus, there's nothing wrong really with killing a child that's around 2. If you decide you don't want it, it's not really a person yet, because, of course, to be a person, you have to pass the mirror test and be able to be self-reflecting. By the way, I don't know if you saw it the other day, there was an article about 10 fish being discovered as being able to pass the mirror test. 10 fish, regular fish. But it was controversial, so I don't know if we will start thinking of certain fish as persons anytime soon. By the way, that also throws into the problem of a corporation. I think I mentioned Mr. Spock before we left. Mr. Spock, of course, is a Vulcan, so he's not human at all. Well, there's no possibility of him being half human. But even so, in the storyline, you certainly accept Vulcans as persons. They talk, they have feelings, they do bad things, they do good things, etc. Right? You know, the Romulans, etc. You know, they're all persons, even though they're not human, of course. Star Trek also got into the question of robots and AI, artificial intelligence, right? As you know, are they persons too? And strictly speaking, by that definition, if a computer gets to the point where it can be self-reflecting, and I suppose HAL in 2001 was a perfect example of that, then in a sense becomes a person. And also we fight over corporations and the idea that a corporation ought not to be a person, etc. But actually a lot of the law was developed assuming that corporations were legal persons, and it would be totally screwed up if we somehow tried to figure out a way of saying that corporations were not legal persons. And that's still a big issue because of Citizens United, that allowed corporations to basically pay money with no limit to political PACs and things. So a lot of people feel like corporations ought to have their personhood status removed. And the thing is, when you look at it, if what describes a person being a person is their ability to be self-reflective, corporations are clearly persons. In the same way that, say, Anchorage is a person. Who is Anchorage? Well, when our assembly meets and they all discuss whether or not they want to allow signage that's larger than a certain size or whatever, and then they say no or yes, and then they vote on it, and then we end up with signs allowed a certain size. Well, that's part of our personhood in Anchorage, in a sense, right? So all of that, and what's the connection there is it's this dialectical process of two different sides. The same thing is that happens with me if I'm interested in eating a candy bar. Ooh, a Snickers, I love Snickers. I mentioned Snickers before, my attachment, no. But so I'll eat the Snickers, and then this little blue angel in my head says, no, you shouldn't eat the Snickers, it's bad for you. It'll put on calories or whatever, it's bad for you, you know. And then the red angel, of course, my other side argues, oh, but you've eaten thousands of these, you know, before, and they're delicious. That won't make a difference, right? You know, so I end up, you know, with this fight within myself. You know, it's very similar to the arguments that go on in the Assembly or the Congress or, you know, the College of Cardinals, you name it. You know, when humans get together and we argue over stuff, it's very similar to the pattern that goes on even within yourself as you argue over what you want to do. Do I need a new car? Should I stick with the old one? Am I in love with that person? Do I hate that person? You know, do I both love and hate that person? You know, all that sort of stuff, right? So this is a dialectical process that evolves your person as you make your decision. You've moved to a different status within yourself, and then you change again every moment. In a sense, you're constantly making decisions. And so does society. And by the way, for Hegel, so does God. So for Hegel, God evolves. Although, keep in mind that God has always been God, always remains the same, etc. But it's our understanding of God that evolves for Hegel. So strictly speaking, it's not unorthodox to follow Hegel's concept of how our understanding of God evolves. So for Hegel, his focus is on what we might call sociology, how sociology changes. So I often argue that when Kant, who was a precursor to Hegel, developed his philosophy, that naturally led into psychology, developing a modern attempt to understand the psychology of human beings. But Hegel the next stage led into the development of sociology, where we're trying to study people in groups and how the dynamics of the groups change. So when we look at Hegel, we already see this idea that sociology, developing, maturing, does so by changing the meta-narrative, or the Weltanschauung, the beliefs of the people, the worldview, right? Welt is world, and Schauung is the way it seems, it appears to us, right? So as the world changes, you end up with the development that it's not only Nietzsche that sees this, but others, for example, Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard, who was even earlier than Nietzsche, student of Hegelian philosophy, even in his own town, University of Copenhagen, but then he moves to Berlin and studies there, oddly, in the same class that Karl Marx studies. So they're both students in the same class. I don't know that they met one another, because it was probably about 200 people in the auditorium. But Søren Kierkegaard rebels against Hegel's system by, of course, being a Hegelian himself, but then arguing over certain particulars within that philosophical tradition. Karl Marx does also, oddly, even though they were both in the same class, they rebelled oppositely. So for Søren Kierkegaard, that dialectical process that goes on in our minds doesn't mean that part of the process is the imposition of our society's will on us, which Hegel argued for. Instead, Kierkegaard argues that you're totally free. So there's no aspect of society's imposing its will on you that has any force, that you are totally free, a free agent, etc. And for Kierkegaard, by the way, that's very depressing. Right? For Marx, by the way, the opposite was the case. There's no point in saying that you're actually a free agent at all. All your thinking is completely dominated by your peers, by your society, by, in fact, for Marx, the means of production, the industrial nature of your society, as a materialist imposition on the way you think. That was Karl Marx, right? Nietzsche, remember, is going to be influenced by Schopenhauer, who in a way responded to this whole process by arguing that Kant's concept of the thing in itself would be better explained by the Buddhist karma, or the will, right, or fate, right? Remember that dominated even Wagner's operas when he described the trials of the gods, Wotan trying to get his way, but of course everything just kept frustrating Wotan until, of course, the gods themselves were destroyed at the end, right? So that fate motif is there in Wagner. Well, Schopenhauer also influenced Nietzsche, so while Schopenhauer argues about the will in representation, how the will is represented in art, Nietzsche argued that the will was the will to power, to dominate others. And remember, Hitler's interpretation of that certainly was very Nietzschean. And by the way, Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth, was a Nazi herself. Some refer to her as a pre-Nazi, but I mean, there's famous pictures of her with Hitler. This looks like.
Let me give you some advice. The process of doing your second drug.
Every dictator needs a philosopher. So as Adolf Hitler took power in 1930s Germany, he cast about for his own version of Joseph Stalin's Karl Marx. He settled on Friedrich Nietzsche, the German genius madman who had been dead since the turn of the century. This was not an intellectual flight of fancy, but a deliberate act of statecraft, according to Ronald Wiener, a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Nietzsche's writing about a future age of imperial politics in which a new caste would rule over Europe, recalling glorious empires of the past, was a blank check that Hitler was free to cash. And so in 1934, the new Führer was photographed at the Nietzsche archives in Weimar and gave Nietzsche's younger sister Elizabeth a wreath for his grave with the words, "To a great fighter." The next year, Hitler gave a set of Nietzsche's books to his ally, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. This was not the legacy he would have chosen. It would have caused Nietzsche great pain, Wiener argues. He was opposed to racism, socialism, and nationalism, all of which the Nazis had to studiously ignore. The key to this awkward appropriation was Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche, and her role has cast a pall over her brother's work ever since. She had been married to Bernhard Förster, a prominent anti-Semite who was involved in trying to create a new Aryan homeland in Paraguay. She shared his views and joined the Nazi Party. Her key contribution was that she spent years compiling Nietzsche's unpublished manuscripts into a single book, billed as his life's work, called The Will to Power. Ever since, the book has been viewed with suspicion, even called a forgery. Nearly a century later, though, it is still widely read, and there is a lot in the rest of Nietzsche's work that continues to attract the interest of the reactionary far right.
And this is a picture of Hitler in the Nietzsche Museum, standing next to the bust of Nietzsche. Interesting, there's a gap there. I don't know why they deliberately did that. However, notice in that video, and I've noticed this with a lot of videos and writings about Nietzsche, and that is that a lot of scholars who study Nietzsche, who are attracted to Nietzsche and like Nietzsche's work, at the same time want to show that Hitler's interest in Nietzsche was a misunderstanding of Nietzsche. And I think that that's deliberate so that they're not considered to be fascist themselves by liking Nietzsche. So there's this effort to distance Nietzsche and Hitler and fascism in general. But I don't think that that's legitimate. I think there's a lot of good reason why I think you could read Nietzsche and see that he does really lead to the kind of attitude that Hitler had. Notice one of Hitler's requirements for his men, the SS, the Schutzstaffel, right? The SS was that they should carry a copy of Nietzsche's book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is kind of the precursor book to Beyond Good and Evil. And this is where the concept of the Ubermensch arises. Uber simply means over, so you have Uber meaning over and Unter meaning under, Unter Abergau, Uber Abergau, literally towns above the river, below the river in Germany. So it's just over. It was the translation of Nietzsche's work did lead to kind of the development of the character Superman in the United States. And by the way, that's why a lot of books would change the translation to be Overman, which sounds weird, but is a more direct translation. Or they would have just left it as Ubermensch, which is the German, right? And the idea was to separate it from this comic book character Superman, which isn't really what Nietzsche was talking about, of course. You know, Superman is an alien from outer space, etc. He's not really human. For Nietzsche, the Ubermensch was a human being, a normal, everyday human being, in fact, maybe even an ill, unhealthy human being, like Nietzsche himself, who mentally understands the narrative that we get from Hegel, and that is that narratives, these meta-narratives, evolve, and they're in competition with one another. So if you think of those as sociologically evolving, right, and becoming better, by the way, they adapt just as animals adapt to the environment. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they're better, but they're certainly fit for the particular environment. So in that sense, meta-narratives adapt to the sociological environment, which of course is embedded in a form of life in a kind of environment. So if you think, why did Islam become the meta-narrative of the Middle East, mostly in the desert communities? Why did Christianity become the meta-narrative of Northern Europe? Actually, all of the Mediterranean area before Islam basically used the sword to persuade a lot of Christians to become Islamic, etc., which of course prompted the crusade eventually, right, to try to take back some of it, etc. So why this competition? You know, how much environment is involved in this? You know, and you could look all around the world and try to analyze why do particular meta-narratives adapt the way they do? Why does the logic of it adapt the way it does, etc., right? Well, one of the aspects of believing this whole narrative is this is itself a narrative, right? When you believe that, you believe the sociological point of view, and if you ask a sociologist, say, like the abortion question, right? So, sociologist, is abortion okay, or is it evil? A sociologist will say, well, so many percent of this community believe that abortion is okay. 75% of New York State, you know, believe it's okay, you know, and 25% don't, or 20% don't, and 5% are neutral, right? You know, but in Tennessee, it's, you know, this much and this much, you know, et cetera. So sociologists will give you numbers based on the polls that they take, the interviews that they take with all the different folks. But then if you turn to the sociologist and say, oh, okay, so after all your study, is abortion good or bad? You know, well, the sociologist looks confused, right? And says, you know, in Tennessee it's this, and you know, it's right. You know, so the sociologist isn't taking from the study a conclusion about the morality of a particular act, etc., right? He's describing the actual data associated with a particular community, which, by the way, of course, could change, right? It's, you know, the polls change. The polls might not even be accurate, right? But if we re-ask everyone 10 years later, there's going to be a difference as different ages. You know, the older people die off. They had different views than the younger people, right? You're familiar with all of that. So the sociologist is in a position to actually decree a particular moral worth of an act. He's instead, or she's instead, describing what the community thinks, right, as it evolves through this. Well, that actual attitude is basically saying that there is no truth to a particular moral perspective. It's just dependent on the vote of the population, of the current speakers, which is why I define true, what is true, as the current belief of the fluent speakers who understand the sentence that I uttered. Is it true or false, right? It's a vote, right? And by the way, that's also even problematic for a person who has a particular intention of saying, I mean You know, I didn't have a racist attitude when I painted my face with black. I was just at a Halloween party. That's right. You know, well, you lose, you know, because the majority rules. So if the majority interprets your intention as being to be racist, your intention not to be racist isn't persuasive. We don't believe you, no matter what your actual intention was, right? So majority rules, which is why, of course, a jury is kind of a wonderful way for that to end up being force in law, for example. So in that sense, the truth is apparently relative, and you know probably from seeing a lot of people feel very upset with relativity in such things, that means there are no truths. I would answer, actually, in relativity, things are much more complex than that. Even when we look at physics, remember that there are these different models that we could use. You know, the Earth goes around the sun goes around the Earth, neither goes around the other. You know, all of these are different models, and it's wrong to say that one is true and the others are false, because they're all just tools that we could use for different things. But in a sense, there are truths, of course, within a particular context. For example, Galileo proves that Venus cannot be going around the Earth. It has to be going around the sun, right? You know, so there are truths within these particular systems, these different contexts, right? The fact that we have different contexts within which each of the different sets of truths are different doesn't mean that there aren't truths. The trick, of course, to using the tools is knowing what's true within which particular context. The folks that believe this are all going to say that this is true. The folks that believe this are all going to say this is true. You know, they're different, and I understand that. And you know, I might be neutral. You know, I'm not going to take sides in this, but I do also believe that it's true that they believe that, and it's true that in that context, the true believers are all going to agree with one another in that particular statement and saying that it's true, whereas this group is all going to believe this, etc., right? So notice that's more complex. It's not as easy as just saying it's true that abortion is wrong. You could get adamant about that, but notice that doesn't actually change the sociological relationships involved in that. You know, being adamant and saying it over and over again with more and more red in your face, that doesn't change that, right? So there are truths, they're contextual. You have to understand the particular context, and that's really the sociological point of view. But it's also a problem for a person who needs a set of beliefs to have their own values. Societies might be complex and have different groups. That does mean that they're less coherent, by the way. A society that all believes in the same faith and has the same values is a much more coherent society, right? A society that's broken up into lots of different groups that argue with one another is going to be obviously less coherent. Youth growing up in that society are going to have a lot more difficulties in knowing what they themselves want to believe. They grow up to be heretics, as Peter Berger argues in The Heretical Imperative. But you end up then with the individual in a quandary, because as you're growing up and you're maybe around high school age, you begin realizing that you don't know what you want to do. You don't know what you believe. And our society has left it up to the individual. In fact, it's the law, right? Separation of church and state. The state can't come in as a state school and impose on you a particular religious belief. There actually is. It's a little bit more complex in that. When we look at John Stuart Mill as one example, John Stuart Mill is a utilitarian British philosopher, atheist, and we will discuss him. He believed that religious narratives basically were essential to the health of a society, but he thought all the traditional narratives were bad. So he was against the traditional religions, kind of like some of our contemporary atheists. But you need a religion for the coherence of the society, so he wanted to create a religion of the state. And so he came up with the idea of having holidays, state holidays, right? And you have statues of the heroes and things, and special celebrations at cemeteries, and you have parades like on the 4th of July, and the flag becomes very significant. Everybody should show a religious respect for the flag and other documents like the Constitution, right? You get the idea, right? So all of that, in a sense, is part of the trappings of a state religion. You can look how historically that evolved, and it's not something that the previous societies held. And it wasn't, of course, just the United States or Britain who were influenced by John Stuart Mill, but the French also. Auguste Comte was another contemporary of John Stuart Mill who also thought the same way, that religion was absolutely essential to the health of the society, but at the same time the traditional meta-narratives were wrong, just caused wars and things of that sort. So it should be a religion of the state. The difference with Auguste Comte was that state religion was mandatory, whereas for John Stuart Mill it was voluntary. So your bosses don't come and make sure you're going to the parade on the 4th of July and showing good state, esprit, right? That's a voluntary thing in the United States and in England. In France, I think it's a little bit more mandatory, although it didn't actually become fully mandatory. But where it got picked up was by Karl Marx. And you notice that the Soviet Union required attendance at all the special events that they had. By the way, it's still that way. I watched a beautiful ceremony in St. Petersburg just a couple days ago, which was a celebration of the breaking of the siege of the Nazis over Leningrad, St. Petersburg, during World War II. Beautiful parade. And it was nice. When I was in MI, military intelligence, we valued anyone that could get pictures of those kinds of parades because it showed all their modern equipment and stuff. Today, the Soviets have drones flying along the parade, making sure you get, close-ups of everything. And that's pretty cool. I'm sure that my contemporaries in MI have a much easier time of it in some ways. Okay, so the problem for the individual then is, how do you determine what's your value? You're offered like a supermarket of choices. It's like going into Freddy's, and everybody's got, their own version of the best chicken soup for the soul, right? There's, hundreds of different varieties, Progresso, plus you could buy the cheap stuff, which is, Freddy's own, variety of it, and you're wondering, gee, should I treat my soul with the cheap food or, go for the more expensive, Campbell's or whatever, right? Well, in a metaphorical way, of course, that's the same kind of dilemma you have, and philosophy, by the way, just makes this worse, because, of course, my job is to present you with Kierkegaard's what kind of meta-narrative does he offer you? What about Nietzsche? What about Owen Flanagan? I mean, one of the philosophers I have on the list, and some of you have elected to do him, is Owen Flanagan, and in his book, The Really Hard Problem, Meaning in a Material World, right? And, when you no longer believe in what we might think of as a spiritual narrative, instead you've got, physics, basically, is determining the way things go. Well, then how do you find meaning out of that gives you a sense of purpose, gives you a picture of the world where you're life is worthwhile, that, it's despite the difficulties in getting up in the morning and living in Alaska where it's cold, etc. Can you feel energetic and feel like today is going to be a great day and get out there and do things, that kind of, So what gives you that impetus? What mental stimulus gives you that impetus? And that mental stimulus, of course, comes from our belief. I'm saying, of course, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like it comes from the story that you believe that you're playing a role in, right? And that is a meta-narrative, which, number one, they're neither true nor false, right? It's an interpretation of the data, right? So how do you do this? And clearly, there's an association with suicide among the middle class, the upper middle class students who basically have everything they need, or at least it seems like they do, and yet at the same time they feel listless, purposeless. Why? Well, they've been convinced that none of the stories that were traditionally valid are believable. It's just nonsense, thanks to people like Christopher Hitchens and others, very persuasive. That's absolute nonsense. Such and such doesn't, there's no guy sitting up on a throne in space, et cetera. None of that's true, right? And that, it just pulls the wind right out of your sails, and, in that case, then how do you prevent yourself from just feeling totally depressed, Well, Kierkegaard gives us some interesting responses that we'll see. But Nietzsche's is this will to power. So how does it work? Well, I feel meaning in my life, says Nietzsche. This is my interpretation, of course, of Nietzsche. I feel power in my life. I feel meaning in my life when I have power over others. So the will to power is not, to have a really good serve, or something in tennis, but the power to persuade others to believe what I want them to believe. So, for example, Madonna. Some boys hug me, some boys kiss me, I think they're okay. If they give me proper credit, I don't turn away. Sorry, I have no talent. For we are living in a material world, and I am a material girl. Okay, that's terrible. I'll fix that. Wait a minute. I can. Madonna. Material girl. This is also way sexier than my rendition of it. So meaning in life is having a great phone that gives you great selfies.
She's fantastic. I knew she'd be a star. She could be great. She could be a major star. She is a star. The biggest star in the universe right now as we speak.
Meaning in life for him is to brown nose his obvious boss.
He touches one thing, he's God. I swear, he's history. I want to meet it. You got it anytime, any place, anywhere, any street, you got it. Now.
Notice how you can look through this filter, by the way, and interpret anything.
Yeah, he's still after me. He just gave me a necklace. I don't know, I think it's for diamonds. Yeah, he thinks they're impressed by giving me expensive
By the way, in
gifts.
interviews, Madonna points out that she is a Nietzschean. if I had an outfit like that, would that make me as sexy as she? Or is that a really bad image? You're all familiar with that song, I'm sure. Yeah, she's been interviewed and argues philosophically she's a Nietzschean, so that that brings up another problem for Nietzsche and for his narrative that says that the will to power is what gives you meaning, because you're desperate for meaning. It's not going to come to you from society, which, by the way, he's part of society, so if you believe him, you're kind of falling for his narrative. But in any case, his argument is that having power over others is what gives your life meaning. And in this sense, she has power over others because we like the video, right? I mean, it was a very popular video. It still is, I suppose. I guess you could look at the stats and see how popular it is. But it creates a problem. And this is where Nietzsche points out that if you've created a successful narrative that people have bought, right? They like it. And so that you're popular now, you know, like Madonna, right? Then the next concert you come to, everyone's expecting you to sing the songs that they like. And that's certainly something that happens. You know, a lot of the concerts, Willie Nelson, his album just won one of the Grammys. I don't know if you've been going through the list and trying to listen to some of them. I was doing that, and some of them are nice, but an awful lot of them are absolutely horrible. I went to Barnes and Ignoble's last night to buy one of the CDs that was on the list, the Shostakovich symphonies, and turned out that they don't have really very many CDs left there at all. That's kind of an odd thing. You know, they're vinyl all over the place. All vinyl records. But have you ever seen anybody selling turntables any place? Where? You know, you kind of need that if you're going to play a record. I don't know. In any case, so once you have this power, people like the song, you know, Taylor Swift's, you know, Love Story, right? Very popular. By the way, she doesn't do anything like that anymore, as far as I know, right? She's had to change her image, right? Madonna does too. The problem is, once people like you singing a particular thing and they want you to do that again, you no longer have the power over them. They have the power over you to make you do what they like. Play it again, Sam. You know, play it again, Sam. Play it. You know, that's like the myth of the Sisyphus again, right? You know, pushing that same stupid rock up the hill. You know, even if Albert Camus says, well, but Sisyphus was happy because he really liked pushing up that rock. You know, yes.
Is it possible this says more about capitalism than Nietzsche's philosophy?
That's a really, really good question. What's the connection? Gosh, we could play with that a lot. There is actually a lot of influence of Nietzsche on American capitalism. I wouldn't say that they're concurrent in the sense that capitalism, I mean, we could trace capitalism back to Adam Smith, you know, the invisible hand and so on. An awful lot of course, what developed the United States was that kind of capitalism. But yes, they definitely fit very well together, and it could certainly be the case that that Nietzsche's philosophy fit so nicely, became a very popular thing in the United States. It really took off in the United States, although there were some that really hated Nietzsche because of the impact Nietzsche had. I highly recommend looking at that, the first video that I showed you just briefly with the philosopher being interviewed about her book on Nietzsche, because she brings up a lot of, remember she's a cultural historian, and so that kind of impact of Nietzsche through various people like Alan Bloom, for example. Alan Bloom wrote a book called The Closing of the American Mind. Can you see these when I put them up? Is that big enough? Yes? So this was a mega hit book-wise. And the main thrust of the book was that Americans began to be so enamored with this meta-narrative of Nietzsche's, of relativity, that individuals started becoming less and less scholastically adept, or they read less, they understood less. In fact, Bloom argues that the real problem was that Americans misunderstood Nietzsche, thinking that there was no truth, that everything goes, anything goes, right? So everybody's just competing against everyone else for stardom, or, you know, if you think about art and how art blossomed, even the piece that's out on our lawn, less so the piece that, of course, I asked about in the lobby, but the piece out on the lawn, that's abstract. And so what is it? You know, we could ask, and you know, we could say, okay, the title of it was Image Intervention, right? And different people talk about it as being, well, it's kind of like a house blown apart in a storm or something, you know, or, you know, whatever. But basically, there's no correct interpretation of it. The one in the lobby, of course, the same thing applies. You know, there's lots of different interpretations, as you all gave. On the other hand, I think you could give the artist certain credit, you know, for his intent, right? Although it's clearly not just that. But so you've got this competition among everyone in art, and those that succeed, it seems almost like just an accident, you know. I mean, what are some of the things that became popular and made lots of money? You know, Tide boxes, you know, Campbell's soup cans, a urinal, pre-made, you know, just selected, you know, for I've chosen that to be viewed as art. You know, right? Everyone's familiar with the urinal or mutt. I mean, that's something Roger Scruton argues about in his video, remember, about kitsch, art and everything. It's not real art. You know, it's a ready-made. It's you know, just selecting a urinal and saying that's art. You know, okay, Duchamp won in that battle, right? He persuaded the stupid people that bought it and put it up in the museum as art. Now, it's wrong of me to say they're stupid people, because I remember when I was in college, we went to the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, on a bus trip. And the one thing I remembered from that museum was going up one stairwell and seeing a pewter dog shit sitting on a pedestal. It looked like a beautiful pile of dog shit, made out of pewter, right? And sitting on a nice pedestal, right? And I thought, that's shit, that's, some artists basically laid a pile of shit on us and they took it, and, that's discouraging, What the heck is wrong with these museum directors that they had opportunities to have good art, and instead we get a pile of shit. By the way, there are some artists that can their own shit and sell it, and people buy it. It's not my fault. It's like artists are literally trying to persuade gullible people into buying their crap. And they do. How does it work? By the way, and part of the process is that the millionaires that have the money to spend and make money off of their money make more money off of their speculation in art than they do off of things like the stock market. They can make like 20% or more on art if it takes off. Sure, they lose, so they might buy 10 pieces. Only one of them has to be a hit 20 years later and go for billions, or millions rather, and they've profited from their efforts, right? The rest of the stuff might be crap, and it never became more than crap. Although, the fact that millionaires would buy it and spend a lot of money on it is part of the social process that persuades other people to think that it's worth money. Right? So it's a very complex interplay of social forces, right? And by the way, the stock market is too, right? It's all psychology, basically. Okay, so if you think of art, and not just Madonna being a Nietzschean, and she changes her presentation of herself every so often, so she's an American girl at one point, right? Who'd have thunk it, right? Then she's a mother writing books for her children, right? And then she's back again, as another singer, etc. So she's constantly surprising, right? And she has to do that, otherwise she's no longer finding meaning in her life because of the power that she has over others, but instead she's being controlled by those others, right? Nietzsche talks about the eternal recurrence. And I remember thinking that what that meant was that you have to keep recreating yourself. You have to keep coming up with a new, powerful narrative to persuade others, because it's the act of actually persuading them to accept the nonsense or serious thing that you're trying to present to them, right? That actually gives you the feeling of success, of purpose, that gives you the sense of meaning in life. And you have to keep redoing that. You can't just rest on your laurels. You have to keep coming up with something new, exciting, and different, right? But a lot of the commentators talking about his concept of eternal recurrence instead refer to it as a odd question that he asked about whether in modern physics, if every moment of every time period is essentially repeated eternally, so that all of time and space exists at once, and in a sense, Nietzsche, for some reason, thought maybe that it recurs, right? So it's an eternal recurrence. And in that context, he asks, is what you're doing with your life right now, the thing or that would give your life meaning, if it's going to occur eternally over and over and over again? So in an interesting sense, that question then becomes, think how valuable your choices are each moment, because you might just want the candy bar instead of showing your discipline over your physical addiction to chocolate and sugar and salt, maybe, right? Maybe that kind of power is the way you want to eternally be at that moment, instead of the addicted candy bar lover that I really am, etc. Right? So the eternal recurrence, kind of an interesting dilemma for him. But I'd like to return to the question of, was he a Nazi? He was definitely against anti-Semitism. Famously, he was in Turin when he was becoming already mentally ill, but he saw a horse being beat in the street and ran over and started crying over the neck of the horse, trying to protect it from the whip of the driver that was basically beating it to death. And he never recovered from that. So in that sense, Nietzsche certainly seems to have been an animal lover. He was against Christianity because he thought Christians basically, in order to be a good Christian, you had to be like a dog. So he called it a dog philosophy. That's kind of an odd sort of thing, because the Christians just do what they're told, basically. Whereas he thought, you have to, in a sense, go beyond good and evil. Instead of believing what society tells us is morally right? Rescue the person that's in danger, help the child that's crossing this, all those different things. Instead, he was arguing, well, but if you're the Ubermensch, you should be doing what's good for you instead of what's good for society, right? But the question then is, well, but how do you determine what's good for you? Maybe rescuing the child in the street or something would be what's best for you. So what would Nietzsche do in that situation? Although, remember, Hitler loved animals too. Maybe I'll find this. There he is. Notice, Hitler loved animals, loved children, clearly was thinking in terms of doing what was best for the German state, although of course we could argue that a lot of what he did was horrible, certainly. So, interesting question for you. If what Nietzsche meant as an Ubermensch was an individual that grows up to be philosophically aware of this competition among meta-narratives for your soul, basically, but that you yourself are free to choose for yourself. And that's what makes you an Ubermensch. You're not one of the merely human who are still going to the church where the dead God lives, right? And by the way, there's a lot of play on that quote, God is dead. As Zarathustra comes down the mountain, it says, God is dead. We have killed him. He's quoting from Martin Luther, who, of course, is referring to Jesus, who was killed for our sins, right? So in that sense, God has been killed on the cross, right? But what Nietzsche is arguing, I presume, is that God is dead because we've gotten to the point where we no longer need that meta-narrative that there is a God. Instead, you are God. You are your own God. So the values that you should live by are now the values that you create for yourself and how you try to persuade others to believe your values, right? So you're your own God now. So we no longer need to believe in those traditional gods. We've evolved past that point, and that makes you the Ubermensch, right? So in a sense, since United States citizens growing up with a public school system that have the separation of church and state, but treat religions as a sociological study, right? So that you could see, I remember teaching at I guess a couple of the high schools doing the social studies text where basically it talks about, say, Constantine the Great conquering under this sign, right, of the cross, etc. And that's how Christianity became, and then it talked in the text about the Nicene Council, for example. So it clearly treats religious progress as a sociological history, right? So the religion that you're imbibing basically in this state religion in our school systems is that sociology, history. History is essentially the evolution of human society. And if you think of it, if you're taught history, that's competitive with the narrative that says, God created all of human, etc. Right? So history is a competing meta-narrative with a lot of those. I forget where I was going with that. Was that interesting? Is this fun? But my question then for you is, how do you feel thinking of yourself as an Ubermensch? And I've had a lot of students respond to that question by saying, I don't think of myself as an Ubermensch. Well, you're just wrong. If you're living in this society, basically that's the heretical imperative, says Peter Berger. And by the way, if you say, well, but I'm a Christian, well, did you choose to be a Christian? Right? That's a trap, right? You see? Because if you're choosing to be a Christian, okay, but you believe that that's your choice, right? Well, that's the Ubermensch that comes in. So you're stuck. It's not like you could say, no, I'm not an Ubermensch. And yet at the same time, I think we associate the concept of the Ubermensch with elitist, fascist, controlling other people. And I think there's good reason for that. So it is uncomfortable to think of ourselves this way. But if you're in our society and you're getting a college education, you're part of the elite. It's not my fault. That's just the data, right? There's 25% of the population of Alaska that has some college. So you're already there. You're already in that top 25%. So does being an Ubermensch, how does it make you feel? Good question. Any other questions for me? You guys having fun? Test 1 is due, right? I think a lot of, by the way, I don't post grades in Blackboard. In fact, Blackboard, by the way, was down a little bit over this weekend. I don't know if they fixed it or not. Another reason why I hate Blackboard. It's totally untrustworthy. But for me to post grades in Blackboard means I would actually have to do math. And I don't like doing math. So I'm not going to. I'd have to put algorithms in, constantly update everybody's grades, and that's a whole nother, no, not gonna do it. I just send you your comments, and basically, though, you shouldn't worry about your grade in the class. Everyone should get an A as long as you send me everything, right? So don't worry about it. Send me everything. And if you don't send me everything, or if it's going to my son, remember some of you are sending email messages to my son whose email address is only one letter different than mine. Don't do that. I don't think he checks his UAA email that often, so be safe out there. Yeah, if you go to this link here, there's test one. Pick either of the three questions. Describe how Socrates corrupted the youth of Athens. Would that be considered corrupting youth today? Question 2, how do we know anything? 3, what sort of things in contemporary art do you find beautiful? How does Aristotle say we should live a virtuous life? Did we do that? I don't remember doing that. What philosopher we have discussed would you use to give a person guidance in leading a good life? Why do you think this advice would be the best? And 6, how might the debate on abortion be best resolved? So pick 3 of those and send me 300 words each for the 3 questions. So 900 words roughly, or more. And I check your document, see that you have 900 plus words, give you an A for it, and then I read it and send you comments. Basically, my responses to those questions. So, another opportunity to practice the vocabulary. Another opportunity to practice the vocabulary. Okay.